All right, we are wrapping up our study of how to solve quadratics. I just want to put it all together and make sure that you guys knew when to use what method of solving quadratics. So the start thinking part says, what are all of the methods that we have used to solve quadratics? We started out by graphing at the beginning. Then we learned how to factor and found out how to solve by factoring. Those are two different things, just factoring and solving by factoring. Then we learned how to square root. Then we learned how to complete the square. And then lastly, we learned how completing the square can be turned into the quadratic formula, which is just a nice way of completing the square. Now, I wanted to go over all of those methods, the benefits of using them, the downfalls, and just how they work. So when you are graphing, while you don't technically have to get one side equal to 0, it's really nice to get one side equal to 0 because then you could say the x-intercepts are your solutions. So get into equals 0 form, change the 0 to a y, graph it, and your x-intercepts are going to be your solutions. The benefit of this is it's super, super easy. The cons of it are that they are not exact answers. And if you do not have Desmos or you don't know how to use a calculator, it's going to become pretty hard to go over and graph super, super accurately without some kind of graphing software. Then we learned how to factor and learned how to solve by factoring. Remember, one of the things you need to do is get one side equal to 0. Then you are going to factor, and then you're going to set the factors equal to 0 and solve. So when you have x squared plus 5x plus 6, you're going to factor. You're going to use the ATB chart, and then either factor by grouping or using the box method. Once you get to x plus 3 and x plus 2 equals 0, you are not done. That just means something times something equals 0. So either something 1 equals 0 or something 2 equals 0. And then you solve and you get -3 and -2. Those are the values that you could substitute in and would make your equation true. You could always test your answers by putting -3 squared plus 5 times -3 plus 6 and make sure you get 0 and then test your other answer. The pros is it's pretty quick and easy. The cons, it doesn't always work. Not every single quadratic can be factored nicely. And then also you need to remember how to factor nicely. A lot of people just factor and then forget to set them equal to 0. So that's the other issue. Now we had solving by square rooting. You are going to want to solve by square rooting if you ever have something that can be got into x squared or something like in parentheses squared form. And the way you're going to do this is you're going to get the x squared or the something in parentheses squared isolated. You're going to square root and do not forget the plus or minus. That's super important and what people forget. And then you are done. So on here, when you have 2x squared plus 1 equals 201, first you're trying to get the x squared isolated by subtract 1, divide by 2, divide by 2. And then when you have x squared equals 100, you are going to square root and get plus or minus 10. Remember, this makes sense because if there is no b term, then it has not been shifted left or right, and it's going to have a positive answer and a negative answer. The only other time you're going to solve by square rooting is if it is in vertex form, something squared like something in parentheses squared, and then you're not going to get opposite answers. The pros, it is super quick and easy. The cons, it doesn't always work, meaning if it is not in the form where there is no b term or where it is not in vertex form, you're not going to be able to solve by square rooting directly until you actually complete the square, but then it's called completing the square. And the other con is people always forget the plus or minus. Be careful with that. Now, the next method we learned was completing the square, and there was just a completing the square process. You need to find out what your magic number is, the number that completes the square. The way you do that is make sure that you have an x squared by itself. If you have a number in front, you're going to have to divide by that number first. So in this case, you have x squared plus 5x plus 6. You are going to do half of 5 and square it, and you find out your magic number is 6.25. Since 6 is not 6.25, you're going to get the 6 to the other side and then add 6.25 to both sides. The other option would have just been add 0.25 to both sides so that 6 does become that magic number that completes the square. Then you are going to end up getting an x, and the number before you squared it, was 2.5, so you would get x plus 2.5 squared equals, and find out what you get after you go over and add the 6.25 to both sides, and you end up getting a 0.25. You're then going to square root, don't forget your plus or minus. In this case, the decimal square roots nicely, and you get plus or minus 0.5. If it did not square root nicely, just leave it as plus or minus that square root. You would subtract 2.5, subtract 2.5, and you get negative 2.5 plus 0.5 and negative 2.5 minus 0.5. and that gets you -3 and -2. Now, the pros of this, it always works. The cons are it's kind of hard. You got to remember how to get that number that completes a square. You have to remember the number that goes inside the parentheses is the b/2 before it is squared. There's many different steps that you can mess up on. On the left-hand side, I showed you the form that you're going to get into, an x and then a plus or a minus, depending on what the value of b/2 is, but it's the b/2 before it's been squared. And then on the other side, you already had a number and you have to add the b/2 after it's been squared. And then lastly, the quadratic formula. If you take ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0 and you complete the square, you end up getting something called the quad formula, which is x equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. The pros are this always works, and the cons are there's many places to mess up. I went over and did that same exact problem, the x squared plus 5x plus 6 equals 0 problem using the quad formula, and you get a -3 and a -2 as well. Don't forget, for quad formula, one side has to equal 0. If you don't do that, your c value is different and it's going to mess everything up. Also remember, if you get a positive under the radical, you have two solutions. If you get a negative under the radical, no solutions. And if you get a 0 underneath the radical, it is going to be one solution because you're just going to be adding 0 and then subtracting 0. Alrighty, let's look over the homework. So on these problems, you are supposed to look at the problem, figure out what you think the best method of solving would be, and then go ahead and solve it. So on this first one, since you can get it into either x squared equals a number form or something in parentheses squared equals a number form, I decided that I am going to solve by square rooting. You get whatever it is being squared by itself, you square root, you don't forget your plus or minus, and then you solve for x. So that's why I did that one by square rooting. The next one, since I knew that these numbers were pretty ugly, the a, b, and c values are ugly, that's not going to be able to be factored because you can't get a winning pair, I decided I'd use the quadratic formula. Popped in my numbers, cranked through, I got -2.1 plus or minus the square root of 19.77 divided by 6.4, and those were the exact answers. I could have gone over and gotten decimals as well, but I decided just to leave it like that. The next one, my original thought was to solve by factoring, but I couldn't find a winning pair, so I knew it was either going to be quadratic formula or completing the square, and I decided to complete the square since I hadn't done it yet. I got the 2 to the other side, I did half of b, squared it, added it to both sides, factored the left-hand side, and then basically solved by square rooting, which is embedded into completing the square method. I got -2.5 plus or minus the square root of 8.25. Since 8.25 is not nicely square rootable, I just left it like that. Now the next one here, since this cannot this can be factored, the ACB chart did work, I decided that I would solve by factoring. I found out the winning pair, I factored, I set each factor equal to 0, and I solved. I got 3 and -1/2. And then lastly, they tell you that the quadratic is in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, and they gave you the graph. So that is a hint that you should be solving by graphing. So I knew that the x-intercepts, which were at -1 and at +4, those would be the solutions. So -1 and 4. And remember, you can always check your answers by subbing the values back in, or if you have Desmos close by, you could always put it into Desmos and see what the x-intercepts would be when you solve it that way. All right, that's it. Hopefully that made sense. There are these 5 different ways that we learned how to solve a quadratic. Thanks for watching.